Shadows of the past. Elijah shifted uncomfortably in his seat at the back of the classroom, his head lowered as if he could somehow sink into the desk and disappear. The voices of his classmates, the constant noise of pencils scratching on paper, and Mr. Thompson's stern tone all blended together into a chaotic hum in his mind. No matter how hard he tried to concentrate, the words and numbers on the board seemed like distant shapes, blurred and out of reach. Elijah. Mr. Thompson's voice cut through the noise, sharp and pointed. Elijah froze, his heart skipping as he looked up. Mr. Thompson was standing at the front of the room, his arms crossed, eyebrows raised in that familiar look of impatience. Elijah didn't know what Mr. Thompson had asked, but he could feel the weight of everyone's stares, pressing down on him, waiting for him to respond. Elijah, are you even paying attention? Mr. Thompson demanded, his tone teetering between annoyance and exasperation. Elijah opened his mouth, but no words came out. His cheeks burned as he looked down at the notebook on his desk, barely scribbled in, just a few jumbled numbers and letters that made no sense. He could feel his classmates' eyes on him, their curiosity mixed with mockery, waiting for him to stumble. His mind was blank, clouded with the weight of feeling lost in every lesson, every day. Mr. Thompson sighed, shaking his head. This is basic, Elijah. You need to keep up if you want to pass this class. He turned back to the board, dismissing Elijah with a wave of his hand. The words echoed in Elijah's mind, repeating over and over, "You need to keep up." But how could he, when every day was like wading through a fog he couldn't see through, let alone understand? The bell finally rang, signaling the end of class, and Elijah let out a silent breath of relief. As the other kids hurried to the cafeteria, Elijah lingered behind, pretending to search for something in his backpack. The truth was, he didn't want to go to the cafeteria. He didn't have anything to eat, and sitting there, surrounded by food he couldn't have, only made the emptiness in his stomach feel sharper, more painful. When he finally made his way to the cafeteria, he picked a quiet spot in the far corner, his backpack clutched against his chest. He watched as other kids laughed and shared their lunches, the smell of food wafting through the air. His stomach rumbled, but he forced himself to ignore it, focusing instead on a spot on the wall. It wasn't long before he heard the familiar sound of footsteps and laughter approaching. A group of boys, led by Jake and Connor, stopped by his table. Jake had that same sneering smile on his face, the one he always wore when he saw Elijah alone. "Hey, Elijah," Jake drawled, his voice dripping with mock concern. "What's for lunch today?" "Oh wait, I forgot. You don't have any." The boys laughed, and Elijah clenched his jaw, keeping his gaze fixed on the table. He'd learned a long time ago that any reaction, any sign of weakness, only made things worse. Connor leaned in, dropping a crumpled sandwich wrapper in front of him. "Here, loser," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "Have some of mine." The smell of food hit Elijah, making his stomach twist painfully. But he kept his face blank, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He refused to let them see how much their words hurt, how hungry he was, how much he longed for just a bit of kindness. "Guess he left his brain at home," Jake muttered, loud enough for the others to hear. Elijah kept his eyes down, the weight of their words pressing down on him, heavy and suffocating. They finally walked away, leaving him alone with the empty wrapper and the hollow ache in his chest. When the last bell of the day rang, Elijah gathered his things quickly, eager to escape the confines of the school. His footsteps were slow and heavy as he made his way down the street, each step feeling like it took more effort than the last. The school day, with its relentless reminders of his inadequacy, had drained him. But he knew he had to keep moving. He had someone waiting for him. At the hospital, Elijah navigated the maze of hallways, his heart racing with a mix of excitement and dread. Visiting his grandmother was the one bright spot in his day, but her frail condition gnawed at him, reminding him of how fragile their life together was. She was all he had left, and he clung to her presence like a lifeline in a storm. When he reached her room, he paused in the doorway, watching her for a moment. She was sitting up in bed, her thin frame swallowed by the blankets, her face pale but her eyes bright as she looked up and saw him. "Elijah," she said, her voice soft but full of warmth. She reached out a shaky hand, and he crossed the room in a few quick strides, sitting beside her bed and taking her hand in his. Her fingers were thin and cold, but her grip was surprisingly strong as she held on to him. "There you are, my boy," she murmured, her eyes crinkling at the corners as she smiled. "Tell me about your day." Elijah hesitated, looking down at their joined hands. He didn't want to tell her about the humiliation, the hunger, the laughter that echoed in his mind long after the day had ended, but he knew she could see through him. She always did. "School was okay," he said quietly, though the words felt hollow. She raised an eyebrow, her gaze piercing. "Just okay. You used to tell me all sorts of stories about school. Now I'm lucky if I get more than a few words." He let out a sigh, the weight of the day pressing down on him. It's hard, Grandma. The kids, the teachers, they don't think I'm smart. And maybe they're right. Maybe I'm just—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. His grandmother's expression softened, and she squeezed his hand, her grip surprisingly firm. "Listen to me, Elijah," she said, her voice low and serious. "Don't let anyone else tell you who you are. They don't see what I see." Elijah looked up, surprised by the fierceness in her tone. She held his gaze, her eyes filled with a steady, unwavering belief that took him by surprise. "You're stronger than you think," she continued, her voice gentle but firm. "Life has thrown you a lot of challenges, but you're still here, aren't you? That means something." He swallowed, nodding slowly. But doubt still lingered in the back of his mind, a dark cloud that wouldn't go away. "But what if I don't know how to handle it all?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She gave his hand a reassuring pat, her expression softening. "You'll learn, Elijah. One step at a time. And remember this. Believe, and you'll see the way. Can you promise me that?" He nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle into him like seeds planted in fertile soil. "I'll try, Grandma. I promise." They sat in silence for a while, the room filled with the soft hum of machines and the faint glow of evening light filtering through the window. Elijah felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in a long time, a warmth that chased away the shadows of the day. He knew that the road ahead was still uncertain, still filled with challenges and heartache. But in that moment, holding his grandmother's hand, he felt a small glimmer of hope, fragile but real. As he left the hospital that evening, her words echoed in his mind, a steady rhythm that matched his footsteps. "Believe, and you'll see the way." Elijah knew that he had a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt that maybe, just maybe, he was not as alone as he had always thought. Seeds of kindness. The morning started like any other for Elijah, trudging down the street with his worn-out backpack slung over one shoulder, his eyes fixed on the pavement. He counted the cracks in the sidewalk, letting the rhythm of his footsteps fill the silence in his mind. A slight chill hung in the air, and he tugged his thin jacket tighter around him, wishing he could simply turn around and go home. But he kept walking, even though the day ahead loomed like a heavy shadow. At school, he slipped into his usual seat at the back of the classroom, hoping to remain invisible. Miss Carter, his English teacher, was already at her desk, sorting through a stack of papers. She was one of the few teachers who made him feel, well, not quite happy, but safe. There was something about the way she spoke to him, a gentle warmth in her voice that made him feel less alone. As the class settled in, Miss Carter began the day's lesson. Elijah tried to follow along, focusing on her voice, but the words blurred together, slipping through his mind like water through a sieve. Every so often, Miss Carter would glance in his direction, and he'd quickly look down, pretending to take notes. Halfway through the lesson, Miss Carter handed out a worksheet. Elijah stared at it, feeling his chest tighten. The words were small, cramped on the page, and he had to squint just to make out the instructions. He picked up his pencil, pressing down hard as he tried to copy the letters, but his hand shook slightly, and the words seemed to shift in and out of focus. Elijah. Miss Carter's voice interrupted his thoughts, gentle but firm. She was standing beside his desk, her gaze soft but penetrating. Are you having trouble with the worksheet? He hesitated, his cheeks flushing. He didn't want to admit it. Didn't want to admit that he could barely see the words, that he'd spent most of his school years squinting at blurred chalkboards and guessing at assignments. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words caught in his throat. Miss Carter waited patiently, her expression kind but concerned. Finally, Elijah managed to nod, just a slight, almost imperceptible movement. Come with me, she said softly, gesturing toward the door. He followed her out of the classroom, his heart pounding in his chest. She led him down the hall to an empty office, where she sat down across from him, folding her hands in her lap. Elijah, she began, her voice gentle but serious. I know that things have been tough for you in class. I've noticed that sometimes you seem distracted or lost. I don't think it's because you don't want to learn. I think there's something else going on. Can you tell me what it is? Elijah looked down, fidgeting with the frayed edge of his notebook. He wanted to explain, to tell her about the way the words blurred and the numbers danced on the page, about the constant guessing and the frustration that gnawed at him day after day. But he didn't know how to put it into words. Instead, he shrugged, feeling a lump form in his throat. Miss Carter watched him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a small case, opening it to reveal a pair of glasses. They were simple, slightly worn, with thin black frames. These were my son's glasses, she explained, holding them out to him. He used to wear them when he was about your age. He doesn't need them anymore, so I thought they might help you. They may not be perfect for your eyes, but let's try them out. Elijah stared at the glasses, feeling a strange mixture of hope and fear. No one had ever thought to ask him if he could see properly. He'd been so used to squinting and guessing that it had become second nature to him. But now, here was Miss Carter, offering him a small, fragile lifeline. He took the glasses with trembling hands, slipping them on slowly. At first, everything looked a bit distorted, the edges sharp and unfamiliar. But then, as his eyes adjusted, the world around him came into focus. Clear, crisp, and startlingly real. He could see the individual fibers on his notebook, the tiny smudges on the surface of the desk, even the faint lines in the wood grain of the floor. Miss Carter handed him the worksheet again, and this time, he could read the words clearly. The letters were sharp, each one distinct and easy to understand. He blinked, his mouth falling open in astonishment. I can see it, he whispered, barely able to believe it. I can actually see it. Miss Carter smiled, her eyes warm and kind. I thought so. You just needed a little help. For a moment, Elijah felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation rising in his chest, a flicker of excitement, a glimmer of confidence. He'd spent so long feeling lost and helpless, struggling through every lesson, that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to understand something, to feel capable. Thank you, he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. He wanted to say more, to explain how much this small act of kindness meant to him, but he couldn't find the words. Miss Carter rested a hand on his shoulder, her expression gentle. You're welcome, Elijah. And remember, you're not behind. You just needed a clear view. The rest of the day felt like a revelation. As he returned to the classroom, wearing the glasses with a newfound sense of pride, he looked around and saw everything in a new light. The chalkboard, once a blur of confusing shapes, was now sharp and clear. He could read the words, understand the equations, follow the lessons without feeling lost. For the first time, he felt like he was a part of the classroom, not an outsider looking in. When he returned to his seat, he noticed a few of his classmates glancing at him, curious and surprised. Jake, the boy who had always tormented him, snickered from across the room. Nice glasses, 4 eyes, he sneered, but Elijah barely heard him. For once, he didn't care what Jake thought. He was too focused on the newfound clarity that surrounded him, the sense of possibility that had been absent for so long. As the day went on, Elijah began to feel a growing sense of confidence. He answered questions in class, raised his hand when Mr. Thompson asked for volunteers, even managed to work through a math problem on the board. Each success, however small, felt like a step forward, a victory over the doubts and fears that had plagued him for so long. After school, Elijah made his way to the hospital, the events of the day still fresh in his mind. He couldn't wait to tell his grandmother about the glasses, about how Miss Carter had helped him, about the way the world suddenly seemed full of possibilities. When he reached her room, she looked up, her face lighting up with a smile as she saw him. "Elijah," she said softly, reaching out a hand. "There you are, my boy." He took her hand, sitting down beside her bed. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, her hand warm and steady in his. "I had a good day at school today," he said finally, his voice filled with quiet pride. She looked at him, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Oh, tell me about it." He hesitated, then took off the glasses, holding them up for her to see. "Miss Carter gave me these," he explained. "They were her son's. She said they might help, and they did. I can actually see the board now. I can read the words, understand the lessons." Her eyes softened, a gentle smile spreading across her face. "I always knew you could do it, Elijah. You just needed a little help to see clearly." They talked for a while longer, sharing stories and memories, her laughter filling the room with warmth. Elijah felt a sense of peace settle over him, a quiet reassurance that he was not as alone as he had always feared. When he left the hospital that evening, he walked with a newfound sense of purpose. The shadows of doubt still lingered, but they felt smaller now, less powerful. Miss Carter's kindness had planted a seed of hope in his heart, a fragile but resilient spark that he knew he would carry with him, no matter what lay ahead. For the first time, he felt that he could face the challenges ahead, that he could rise above the labels and expectations that had weighed him down for so long. He was still learning, still growing, but he knew now that he was capable of more than he had ever imagined. As he walked home, the glasses perched on his nose, and the memory of his grandmother's smile fresh in his mind. Elijah felt a quiet determination take root within him. He was not just the boy who struggled, not just the boy who sat alone at the back of the classroom. He was Elijah, resilient, hopeful, and ready to carve out his own path, one step at a time, a glimpse of success and a tragic loss. The next week passed in a blur for Elijah. Every day, he took his seat at the back of the classroom with a quiet, steady determination, wearing the glasses Miss Carter had given him. Now that he could see clearly, everything seemed different, almost as if he were walking through a world that had finally come into focus. His confidence was still fragile, tentative, but it was there, growing with every small success. In math class, Mr. Thompson was explaining a new concept, his voice as dry and impatient as ever. Normally, Elijah would have been completely lost, his mind drifting as he tried to make sense of the blurry shapes on the board. But now he could follow along, reading each number and symbol clearly, understanding the logic behind each step. He glanced down at his notebook, where he'd carefully copied each example. The words and numbers didn't blur together like they used to. Instead, they seemed almost inviting, waiting for him to tackle them. It was a strange feeling, this sense of being in control, and he found himself sitting up a little straighter, focusing intently on the board. Mr. Thompson finished his explanation, then turned to the class with his usual critical gaze. "All right," he announced, crossing his arms. "I'll call on a few of you to solve problems on the board. No notes, no help. Let's see what you remember." A familiar wave of anxiety washed over Elijah, and he gripped his pencil tightly. forcing himself to take slow, steady breaths. He reminded himself of Miss Carter's words, the warmth in her voice when she'd said, "You're not behind, Elijah. You just needed a clear view." He clung to that memory, using it to steady himself as Mr. Thompson scanned the room. One by one, Mr. Thompson called on students to come to the front and solve problems on the board. Some of them stumbled, scratching their heads as they tried to remember the steps, while others breezed through the equations, earning Mr. Thompson's nod of approval. Elijah felt his heart race, his palms growing sweaty as he waited, hoping that he wouldn't be chosen. But then, inevitably, he heard his name. "Elijah," Mr. Thompson said, his voice as sharp as ever. "Why don't you come up and solve this one?" Elijah swallowed, his mind racing. He knew every pair of eyes in the room was on him, watching, waiting. He could practically feel the skepticism in their gazes, the unspoken assumption that he would fail. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to ignore the whispers and snickers that echoed around him, and slowly made his way to the front of the room. Mr. Thompson picked up a piece of chalk and scribbled a problem on the board. 2,4x plus 10 equals 9. Elijah stared at it for a moment, his mind processing each part of the equation. He remembered the steps Miss Carter had shown him, the way she patiently explained how to break down each problem, piece by piece. He picked up the chalk, his hand steady, and began to speak, his voice quiet but clear. "First, I'll distribute the 2 to both terms inside the parentheses," he said, writing 8x plus 20 equals 9 on the board. The room was silent, and for a moment he was acutely aware of every gaze locked on him. But he pushed the thoughts away, focusing instead on the numbers in front of him. He continued, his confidence growing with each step. "Next, I'll subtract 20 from both sides to isolate the term with x," he said, writing 8x equals minus 11. A faint murmur rippled through the class, and he glanced back, catching a glimpse of surprise on some of his classmates' faces. Even Mr. Thompson's expression had softened slightly, his usual frown replaced by something closer to curiosity. Finally, Elijah wrote the last step. "Then, I'll divide both sides by 8 to solve 4x. He finished, writing x equals minus 11/8. He stepped back, staring at the completed problem, a strange, exhilarating sense of pride filling his chest. For the first time, he'd solved a problem in front of the entire class, and he'd gotten it right. The realization washed over him, warming him from the inside out, as he turned to look at Mr. Thompson, waiting for his reaction. Mr. Thompson raised his eyebrows, nodding slowly. "That's correct, Elijah," he said, sounding almost reluctant. "Good job." A faint ripple of surprise and admiration passed through the room, and Elijah felt a small, tentative smile tug at the corners of his mouth. He knew this was just one problem, one small success, but to him, it felt monumental. For the first time, he'd proven something, not just to his classmates or his teacher, but to himself. He could do this. He was capable. As he returned to his seat, he heard Jake, the boy who taunted him mercilessly, mutter from the back of the room, "No way. He just got lucky." Elijah ignored him, his head held high. The insults didn't sting as much this time. He had something stronger to hold on to now, a small but steady sense of pride that shielded him from the cruel words. For once, he didn't care what Jake or anyone else thought. The rest of the day passed in a blur of newfound confidence and cautious excitement. When the final bell rang, Elijah practically bolted from the classroom, eager to share his accomplishment with his grandmother. He knew that she'd be proud of him, that she'd smile and tell him how she'd always believed in him, even when he'd struggled to believe in himself. He hurried down the street, the afternoon sunlight casting long shadows on the pavement as he made his way to the hospital. But as he walked through the hospital doors, a strange feeling settled over him, a sense of unease that he couldn't quite explain. The nurses in the hallway glanced at him with unreadable expressions, their faces shadowed with something that made his heart skip a beat. When he reached his grandmother's room, he stopped in the doorway, his breath catching in his throat. The bed was empty, the sheets neatly tucked as if no one had ever been there. His grandmother's chair, her blankets, even the little vase of flowers he'd brought her last week, they were all gone, leaving the room bare and hollow. Elijah. He turned, his heart pounding as he saw a nurse standing in the doorway. Her face was soft, gentle, but there was a sadness in her eyes that made his stomach twist. "Elijah," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your grandmother. She passed early this morning." The words hit him like a punch to the chest, knocking the breath out of him. He felt the world tilt, the floor seeming to drop away as the nurse's words echoed in his mind. She was gone. His grandmother, the one person who had always been there for him, who had believed in him even when no one else did. She was gone. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling. "No, that can't be. I just saw her yesterday. She was fine." The nurse stepped closer, resting a hand on his shoulder, her expression full of sympathy. But he barely felt it. All he could feel was the hollow, aching emptiness spreading through his chest, filling every part of him with a grief so deep, so overwhelming, that he could barely breathe. He stumbled into the room, collapsing onto the bed, his hands clutching the blanket as he buried his face in his arms. The tears came hard and fast, racking his body as he sobbed, the weight of his grief pressing down on him like a heavy, suffocating blanket. He cried until his throat was raw, until his face was soaked and his body felt hollow and drained. She had been his rock, his anchor, the one person who had made him feel safe, who had loved him unconditionally. And now she was gone, leaving him alone in a world that suddenly felt cold and empty. The nurse sat beside him, silent, her presence a quiet comfort as he let the grief consume him. When the tears finally slowed, leaving him empty and numb, she spoke softly. "Would you like a moment alone?" she asked gently. He nodded, barely hearing her, his mind a haze of grief and disbelief. All he could think of were his grandmother's last words to him, the promise he'd made to keep going, to believe in himself. But now that promise felt impossible to keep. She was gone, and with her, the last piece of his world had crumbled. He sat in silence, clutching the blanket tightly, as if trying to hold on to the faintest trace of her presence. But it was already fading, leaving him with nothing but memories and a hollow ache that seemed to stretch on forever. That night, Elijah wandered the streets, unable to bear the thought of going back to their empty apartment. The city lights blurred around him, casting faint, flickering shadows as he walked, his mind blank and numb. He found himself in a small park near the hospital, sinking onto a bench as exhaustion tugged at him. He pulled his knees to his chest, clutching his backpack tightly, as if it were the only anchor left in a world that felt adrift. The stars were faint above him, hidden by the city's glow, but he searched for them anyway, remembering how his grandmother had always told him to look to the stars when he felt lost. But tonight, he couldn't see them. All he could see was darkness, stretching endlessly above him, pressing down on him with a weight that felt unbearable. He buried his face in his knees, letting the tears come again, a quiet, steady stream that he couldn't stop. In the silence, he whispered into the night, his voice barely audible. "I don't know if I can do this, Grandma. I don't know if I can keep going." He closed his eyes, letting exhaustion pull at him, feeling the emptiness settle deeper in his chest. But somewhere, deep in the back of his mind, he heard her voice, soft and steady, like a faint echo. "Believe, and you'll see the way." And as he sat there, alone and heartbroken, he clung to those words, a fragile thread of hope in the darkness. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to keep him going, if only for one more day. Strangers and shelter. Elijah woke the next morning to the cold, gray light of dawn filtering through his bedroom window. The air in the small apartment felt heavy, weighed down by a silence that seemed unnatural, even oppressive. He lay still, staring at the ceiling, his mind sluggish and blank. The events of the previous day washed over him in a numb, distant wave, like a memory too painful to touch. His grandmother was gone. The words echoed in his mind, sharp and cold, cutting through the fog of his thoughts. She was gone, and he was alone. A knock on the door broke the silence, and he sat up, his heart pounding. He had almost forgotten. Miss Lee, the woman from social services, had told him that she would be stopping by to discuss arrangements. The word felt hollow, stripped of any real meaning, like something from a different world. He opened the door to find Miss Lee standing in the hallway, her expression carefully neutral, though her eyes held a hint of sympathy. She was dressed neatly in a dark suit, holding a clipboard and a manila folder that looked thick with paperwork. She offered him a small, practiced smile. "Good morning, Elijah," she said softly, stepping inside. "I know this must be very difficult for you, and I'm so sorry for your loss. I'm here to help, to make sure you're taken care of." Elijah nodded, his throat tight. He didn't want her help, didn't want to be taken care of. All he wanted was for things to go back to the way they had been, to hear his grandmother's voice, to feel her hand in his, warm and steady. But he knew that was impossible. Miss Lee sat down at the small kitchen table, motioning for him to join her. She opened the folder, pulling out a stack of documents and flipping through them with a calm, practiced efficiency. "Elijah," she began, her voice gentle but businesslike, "since your grandmother was your legal guardian, and there are no other family members available to take custody, we'll need to place you in foster care. It's a temporary arrangement, just until we can find something more permanent." Elijah's chest tightened. Foster care. The words felt foreign, almost like a punishment. He'd heard about the foster system, about kids who were shuffled from one family to the next, strangers who took them in out of obligation rather than love. The thought made his stomach twist with dread. I don't want to go to foster care," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Miss Lee's expression softened, and she reached out, resting a hand on his shoulder. "I understand," she said gently. "But right now, we need to make sure you're safe. The foster family we've arranged for you is experienced, and they're very kind. It's just for a little while, until we can work something out." He looked away, swallowing hard. He felt like a stranger in his own life, like everything he had known and loved had been stripped away, leaving him adrift in a world he didn't recognize. The drive to the foster home was long and silent. Elijah stared out the window, watching the city blur past in a haze of concrete and steel, feeling the weight of his loss settle deeper in his chest. Miss Lee tried to make small talk, asking him about school, about his favorite subjects, but he barely responded. His mind was a foggy, hollow space, filled with memories of his grandmother and the life he'd lost. When they finally pulled up to the house, Elijah felt a flicker of apprehension. The house was small and neatly kept, with a garden in the front and a pale blue door that looked freshly painted. A couple stood on the porch, waiting for him, their expressions warm but cautious. "This is Mr. and Mrs. Parker," Miss Lee said, gesturing to the couple as they stepped forward. "They'll be your foster parents for now." Mrs. Parker was a short, round woman with curly hair and a gentle smile. Mr. Parker was taller, with a quiet, steady presence and kind eyes. They greeted him warmly, their voices soft and welcoming. But Elijah could barely muster a response. He felt like an outsider, a visitor in someone else's life, and he couldn't shake the feeling of being displaced, uprooted. Inside, the house was cozy and well-kept, filled with the scent of fresh bread and vanilla. The living room was decorated with family photos and warm, earthy colors, a stark contrast to the sterile, empty hospital room he'd visited so many times. Mrs. Parker led him to a small bedroom at the end of the hall, where a neatly made bed and a small desk awaited him. "This will be your room," she said gently, her eyes full of warmth. "If you need anything, please don't hesitate to ask." Elijah nodded, mumbling a quiet thank you before she left him alone. He stood in the middle of the room, feeling the weight of his grief press down on him, suffocating and relentless. This was supposed to be his home now, but it felt like a stranger's house, a place where he didn't belong. Days turned into weeks, and Elijah drifted through them in a numb haze. He went to school, completed his assignments, and returned to the Parkers' house, where he ate dinner in silence and retreated to his room. The Parkers were kind, always offering him a warm smile or a comforting word, but he kept his distance, feeling as though he were living behind a glass wall, separated from the world by his own grief. At school, things were no easier. Jake and the other boys continued to taunt him, their whispers and sneers a constant reminder of his isolation. Even his newfound confidence felt fragile, slipping away with each passing day. Without his grandmother's presence, without her unwavering belief in him, he felt lost, adrift in a world that seemed to move on without him. One afternoon, as he sat alone in the library, he felt a tap on his shoulder. He looked up to see an older man standing beside him, a faint smile on his face. He was tall and thin, with silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard, dressed in a worn but tidy sweater. "Mind if I sit here?" the man asked, gesturing to the chair across from him. Elijah shrugged, not really caring one way or the other. The man sat down, placing a stack of books on the table and opening one with a quiet, thoughtful expression. For a few minutes, they sat in silence, the man absorbed in his book while Elijah stared at the pages of his own, barely reading. But then, the man glanced up, his gaze thoughtful. "You're Elijah, right?" he asked, his voice gentle. Elijah looked up, surprised. "Yeah," he said slowly. "How did you know?" The man smiled, a hint of warmth in his eyes. "Miss Carter told me about you," he explained. "She's an old friend of mine. She thought you might need someone to talk to." Elijah frowned, feeling a pang of irritation. He didn't want anyone's pity, didn't want to be a charity case, but the man's expression was kind, patient, and he felt his irritation slowly fade. "I'm Mr. Hargrove," the man continued, offering a hand. Elijah hesitated, then shook it, feeling the man's grip firm and steady. They talked for a while, their conversation hesitant at first, but gradually warming. Mr. Hargrove had a quiet, unassuming presence, and he didn't push Elijah to talk about anything he wasn't ready to share. Instead, he told him stories about his own childhood, about the struggles he had faced, and the people who had helped him along the way. As the days passed, Elijah found himself looking forward to his meetings with Mr. Hargrove. They would sit in the library, sometimes talking, sometimes just reading in comfortable silence. Mr. Hargrove had a way of making him feel seen, understood, without judgment or pity. One afternoon, as they sat together, Mr. Hargrove looked at him, his gaze thoughtful. "Elijah," he said slowly, "I know that you've been through a lot, and I know that it's hard to see beyond the pain right now, but I want you to remember something." Elijah looked up, meeting his gaze. "You have a strength in you that most people don't have," Mr. Hargrove continued, his voice gentle but firm. "You've faced challenges that would break a lot of people, and you're still here. You're still standing. That's something to be proud of." Elijah felt a lump form in his throat, his chest tight with a mixture of emotions he couldn't quite name. He nodded, swallowing hard, feeling the weight of Mr. Hargrove's words settle over him like a warm, comforting blanket. As he left the library that day, a faint spark of hope flickered in his chest, fragile but real. He still missed his grandmother, still felt the ache of her absence like a hollow space in his heart. But for the first time, he felt that he might be able to carry on, to find a way forward, even if the path was uncertain. The Parkers continued to support him, their kindness unwavering, and he found himself slowly opening up to them, allowing them into the quiet, hidden parts of his life. They didn't replace his grandmother, no one could, but they offered him a place of warmth, a sense of stability that he hadn't felt since her passing. With Mr. Hargrove's guidance and the Parkers' steady presence, Elijah began to find his footing, one small step at a time. He returned to school with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to honor his grandmother's memory, to live up to the promise he had made to her. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, that there would be days when the grief and loneliness would feel overwhelming. But he also knew that he wasn't alone. And as he walked through the hallways of the school, his head held high, he felt a quiet strength building within him, a resilience that he knew would carry him forward. He was Elijah, resilient, hopeful, and ready to face whatever lay ahead. Rising from the ashes. Elijah adjusted the glasses on his nose, squinting at the geometry problem in front of him. The numbers and shapes felt foreign, like a puzzle he hadn't quite figured out how to crack. He stared at the diagram, the faint murmurs of his classmates filling the background as they worked on their own assignments. For a moment, the familiar anxiety crept in, whispering that he couldn't do it, that he would never understand. But then he remembered Mr. Hargrove's words. "You've faced challenges that would break most people, and you're still here. You're still standing." Taking a deep breath, he closed his eyes, letting the memory of those words fill him with a quiet determination. Elijah had grown used to Mr. Hargrove's steady presence over the past year. Every Tuesday and Thursday after school, they met in the library, where Mr. Hargrove would help him with math problems, science concepts, and occasionally, books on subjects Elijah had never even heard of. The man had a patient, almost unshakable calm about him, and he never seemed surprised by Elijah's questions, no matter how basic or complicated. It was like he genuinely believed Elijah could learn anything as long as he was willing to try. Under Mr. Hargrove's guidance, Elijah's world began to open up. He no longer felt like he was just trying to survive each day, drifting aimlessly from one class to the next. For the first time, he felt a sense of purpose, a direction. The idea of going to college, something he'd once dismissed as an impossible dream, began to feel like a real, tangible goal. "Elijah," Mr. Hargrove said one afternoon as they sat together in the library, his voice thoughtful, "have you thought about what you want to do after high school?" Elijah looked up, surprised by the question. He'd thought about it, of course, but it had always seemed like a distant, unreachable possibility, something for other kids who had stable families, who didn't struggle with rent money, who didn't carry the weight of loss with them everywhere they went. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "College seems far away and expensive." Mr. Hargrove nodded, his expression serious but kind. "It is expensive," he agreed, "but there are ways to make it happen. Scholarships, grants, financial aid. They're there for students like you, students who have a real passion and drive to succeed. If you're willing to put in the work, there's no reason you can't go to college." Elijah looked down at his hands, his mind racing. He could almost hear his grandmother's voice, her words echoing in the back of his mind. "Believe, and you'll see the way." She'd always believed in him, always told him he was capable of more than he thought. He could feel her presence, faint but steady, like a quiet warmth in his chest. "I want to try," he said finally, his voice firm. "I want to make something of myself. For her." Mr. Hargrove smiled, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. "Then let's get started." From that day on, their study sessions took on a new intensity. Mr. Hargrove began introducing him to subjects beyond his schoolwork, challenging him with advanced math problems, science articles, and even philosophy essays. At first, the material was overwhelming, a maze of unfamiliar concepts and ideas. But Mr. Hargrove was patient, breaking down each problem, each theory, into manageable steps, guiding him through it with a steady hand. As the months passed, Elijah's grades began to improve. He wasn't the best in his class, not yet, but he was no longer the kid struggling at the back of the room, the one everyone assumed would fail. His teachers began to notice, offering him small words of encouragement, nods of approval that made him feel seen, respected. One afternoon, as he was gathering his things after school, Miss Carter approached him, her expression warm and full of pride. "Elijah, I just wanted to say, I've noticed how hard you've been working. It's inspiring. You've come so far." Elijah felt a flush of pride, his chest swelling with a mixture of gratitude and determination. "Thank you, Miss Carter," he said quietly. "I couldn't have done it without you. And Mr. Hargrove, too." She smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Mr. Hargrove is a good friend to have. And so am I, if you ever need help with anything. Remember, you're not alone." The words stayed with him, a reminder that he had a support system, people who cared about him. He wasn't alone, even if the journey ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges he could only begin to imagine. As he moved into his junior year, Elijah began to think seriously about his future. He spent hours in the library, researching colleges, scholarships, and fields of study. Science had always fascinated him, especially chemistry and physics, the way they seemed to unlock the secrets of the world, revealing the underlying patterns and structures that made up reality. He loved the way each formula, each reaction, felt like a puzzle, a glimpse into the hidden mechanisms of the universe. One day, as he was poring over a chemistry textbook, Mr. Hargrove leaned over, glancing at the page. "Thinking of going into science, are we?" he asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. Elijah looked up, grinning sheepishly. "Maybe. I like chemistry. It just makes sense to me, you know." Mr. Hargrove nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's a good field," he said quietly. "And it's not easy. But something tells me you're up for the challenge." Elijah felt a surge of confidence, a fierce determination that filled him with a sense of purpose. He wanted to go into science, to make something of himself, to honor his grandmother's memory by becoming the person she'd always believed he could be. It wouldn't be easy. He knew that, but he was willing to fight for it, to put in the work, no matter how difficult it might be. But not everyone saw his ambition in the same light. One afternoon, as he was walking through the school hallway, he ran into Jake, the boy who had taunted him for years. Jake had grown taller, his voice deeper, but his sneer was the same, a mixture of arrogance and disdain. "Look who it is," Jake drawled, crossing his arms. "Still trying to be a genius, huh? You really think you're gonna go to college, Elijah? Dream on. Kids like you don't go anywhere." Elijah felt a flash of anger, a hot, burning resentment that tightened his jaw. But he took a deep breath, reminding himself of Mr. Hargrove's advice. "You can't control what people say about you, Elijah, but you can control how you respond." He met Jake's gaze, his expression calm but unyielding. "Maybe kids like me don't usually go anywhere," he said quietly, his voice steady. "But I'm not going to be like everyone else." Jake snorted, rolling his eyes. "Yeah, right. Keep dreaming, loser." Elijah watched as he walked away, feeling a surge of determination rise within him. He knew that there would always be people like Jake, people who doubted him, who didn't believe he could succeed. But he also knew that he had a strength they couldn't see, a resilience forged in the fires of grief and loss. He continued to work tirelessly, pouring himself into his studies, his dreams, fueled by the memory of his grandmother, and the unwavering support of Mr. Hargrove. Each day felt like a step forward, a small victory in the long journey he'd set out on. Finally, the day came when he received his first acceptance letter, a thick envelope from a state university with a respected science program. His hand shook as he opened it, his heart pounding in his chest as he scanned the words, barely daring to believe it. "Congratulations, Elijah. We are pleased to offer you admission." He sank onto the couch, staring at the letter in disbelief. He'd done it. He was going to college. All the late nights, the long hours in the library, the sacrifices, they had paid off. He could almost hear his grandmother's voice, soft and steady, whispering in the back of his mind, "Believe, and you'll see the way." When he told Mr. Hargrove, the older man's face lit up with a proud smile. "I knew you could do it," he said, his voice full of warmth. "I'm proud of you, Elijah. You've come a long way." Elijah felt a wave of gratitude, a deep, overwhelming sense of pride and relief. He had made it this far, had defied the odds stacked against him. But he knew that his journey was only beginning, that there were still challenges ahead, battles he would have to fight. He was ready, though, ready to face whatever came his way, armed with the strength he had found within himself. As he walked through the school halls for the last time, his head held high, he felt a quiet, unbreakable resolve. He had risen from the ashes of his past, forged a path through the darkness, and now he was ready to step into a new chapter. Elijah had become more than just a survivor. He had become someone who could change his own life, who could shape his own future. And as he looked up at the stars that night, he felt a deep, abiding sense of peace, knowing that he was not defined by his past, but by the strength he had found in himself. A full circle. Years later, the late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the familiar streets of Elijah's hometown. Though the sidewalks were still the same, lined with small shops and rows of trees, the world seemed different through Elijah's eyes. Now, at 29, he was a respected scientist, leading a research team in environmental chemistry at a prominent university. He had achieved what his younger self could only have dreamed of, earning his degree with honors and dedicating his life to finding solutions for sustainable energy. But today, he wasn't here for research or recognition. Today, he had returned to speak to a group of students at his old high school, at the invitation of his former mentor, Mr. Hargrove. Elijah's palms were surprisingly sweaty as he parked in the school's lot, memories flooding back in waves. It felt strange to be back here, to walk the same halls where he had once felt so invisible, so small. The auditorium was filled with students, all eyes watching him as he walked onto the stage. Mr. Hargrove, now retired but still active as a volunteer tutor, was standing at the side, beaming with pride. Elijah nodded to him, his heart swelling with gratitude as he thought of the many hours they had spent together, the countless words of encouragement that had guided him through his darkest moments. Elijah took a deep breath, glancing out at the rows of students who sat, eyes fixed on him. He saw himself in their faces, in the shy glances, the looks of uncertainty, the eagerness mixed with doubt. For a moment, he felt a lump rise in his throat, a reminder of how far he had come and how much he wanted to offer these students the same hope he had once needed. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady and warm. "My name is Elijah Sanders. I sat in these very seats in this very room over a decade ago, and like many of you, I struggled. I was called names, made to feel less than, and there were days when I didn't believe in myself. But I'm here today to tell you that it doesn't have to be that way forever." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Elijah could feel the students' curiosity growing. He shared stories of his early struggles, the way he'd felt lost in a world that seemed to move on without him. He told them about Miss Carter, who had given him his first pair of glasses, and about his grandmother, whose belief in him had been his anchor. He spoke of Mr. Hargrove, who had introduced him to the wonders of science and learning, and of the hours he had spent in the library, discovering a world of knowledge he'd never known existed. "But there's one lesson I want you to take with you today," he said, his gaze steady as he looked out at the sea of faces. "You are not defined by what people say about you. Your potential is not measured by others' opinions, or even by the challenges you face. Your potential is defined by what you believe is possible, and by your willingness to fight for that belief. Believe in yourself, even if no one else does." He paused, letting his words sink in. The room was silent, each student lost in thought, and he could see the flicker of understanding in their eyes. For a moment, he felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that he was offering them a lifeline, just as others had offered him 1 year ago. After his speech, students approached him with questions, eager to learn about his journey. Some asked about college, others about his work in environmental science, but many simply wanted reassurance, a reminder that they, too, could rise above their circumstances. Elijah answered each question patiently, offering words of encouragement, a kind smile, and a reminder that they were not alone. As the last of the students trickled out of the auditorium, Elijah was approached by a familiar face. Jake, his high school tormentor, stood in the doorway, looking older but instantly recognizable. His shoulders were hunched, his gaze uncertain, as if he were debating whether or not to approach. Elijah took a deep breath, feeling a mixture of emotions rise within him. He hadn't thought of Jake in years, hadn't allowed himself to dwell on the memories of those difficult days. But now, standing face to face with the boy who had once caused him so much pain, he felt a strange, unexpected sense of compassion. Jake took a hesitant step forward, his eyes flicking up to meet Elijah's. "Elijah, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "For the way I treated you. I didn't understand back then." Elijah felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a sense of release he hadn't expected. He looked at Jake, seeing not the boy who had bullied him, but a man who had grown, who had come to acknowledge his mistakes. He reached out, offering a handshake, his voice steady and kind. "Thank you, Jake," he said simply. "We were kids back then. We've both come a long way." Jake's face lit up with relief, and he shook Elijah's hand, nodding gratefully. They spoke for a few minutes, catching up on life, on the unexpected paths they had both taken. As they parted ways, Elijah felt a sense of closure, a peace that seemed to settle deep within him. He realized that forgiveness wasn't just a gift to the other person. It was a gift to himself, a way of releasing the past and making room for the future. As he walked out of the auditorium, Elijah felt a deep sense of fulfillment, a quiet pride that filled his chest. He had come full circle, returning to the place where his journey had begun, but this time as someone who had overcome, who had built a life on the foundation of resilience and hope. The following day, Elijah found himself standing at the edge of the old park where he had spent countless hours as a teenager, lost in thought and grief. The memories were vivid. The nights he had sat alone, staring up at the stars, clinging to the faintest hope that things would get better. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool autumn air filled his lungs, and looked up at the sky, where a scattering of stars had begun to emerge in the fading light. A soft voice seemed to echo in his mind, a memory of his grandmother's words. "Believe, and you'll see the way." The stars shone faintly, like tiny beacons of hope, and he felt her presence, her love, surrounding him in the quiet stillness. Elijah reached into his pocket, pulling out the glasses Miss Carter had given him all those years ago. He held them in his hand, feeling the weight of their history, the memories they carried. They were scratched and worn, no longer of use to him, but he had kept them as a reminder of where he had come from, and of the people who had believed in him when he hadn't been able to believe in himself. He smiled, feeling a quiet gratitude settle over him, a gratitude that was as much for the struggles as it was for the triumphs. Those struggles had shaped him, had given him the strength to face the challenges of life with resilience and hope. And now he could offer that hope to others, to the students he had spoken to anyone who needed a reminder that they were not alone. As he slipped the glasses back into his pocket, he made a silent promise to himself, to continue giving back, to help others find their own strength, their own path forward. His journey wasn't over. It had simply come full circle, and now he was ready to walk alongside others as they carved out their own paths. Elijah left the park with a light heart, his steps steady and sure. He had come from a place of darkness, of doubt, but he had risen, built a life on the foundation of resilience, and now he was ready to inspire others to do the same. In the fading light of dusk, Elijah walked away from the past, toward a future filled with promise and purpose. He was no longer the boy who had felt invisible, small, and lost. He was Elijah, strong, resilient, and ready to make a difference in the world, one step at a time.